Why hello YouTube, greetings from the Lazy Eyebrow to a review of a different kind of beat. It's a return to G1 with Starscream and Astrotrain, two Decepticon villains whose alt modes I rather enjoy and yet I've never really had the opportunity to talk about properly. Astrotrain because he was my first ever review and I never redid the subject and figured a diet review was an appropriate place to do so, and Starscream because I've never owned one before, and for that matter I still don't. This particular copy was lent to me by our downstairs neighbors, in which I have an incredibly hard time figuring out if this is a reissue or not. So let's get to that reviewing. But first, did you know over 60% of the people watching this video on this channel hate being told whether or not they're subscribed, and me telling you to do so won't change whether or not I bring this up again. So let's first talk about alt modes. First up is Astrotrain. Here he is in his locomotive mode. What locomotive is he exactly? Well, apparently this isn't as clear-cut and dry as I once assumed. TF Wiki states he's a JNR D51, which is a 282
Mikado
class locomotive. This is what I based my model on with as accurate of dimensions as I could get, and yet a good chunk of comments point to a footnote on a different Wikipedia article claiming he's a JNR D62, which is a 284 Berkshire. Well, we'll never know for sure what exactly this locomotive is supposed to be. For sake of argument, there is a lot of transformation junk in this area obscuring a conclusive answer. In addition to the fact that those wings push the trailing wheels further back for clearance sake, so sure, it's possible this might be the case. Not to mention, it's not like the animation shed any light on this matter either, as it omitted the trailing wheels entirely, opting for a 280 consolidation configuration. I don't know why this is never brought up in the conversation of Astrotrain's alt mode, but what do you do? Anyway, what we're left with is the argument of it makes sense for it to be 4 back here, which I don't really agree with to start with, and the toy had 2 casters in front and 2 in the back, and those are there to represent his pilot and trailing wheels for a 282 Mikado locomotive. Personally, I think this is the most likely argument, the latter half that is. Not only does it make sense for the G1, but it's also the design they deliberately repeated in Siege. But hey, all you in Camp Berkshire, you keep holding on to that footnote on Wikipedia if that's what's keeping you going. Anyway, all that backstory aside, I do quite like this alt mode. It's not 100% perfect as a purple locomotive. This is of course due to its triple changing properties, especially on the casters hanging out of the roof of the cab, and an argument can be made the thruster bells aren't exactly what you'd call accurate, but I love that it's just worked into the design anyway, and accepted. This is the epitome of a rocket sled on rails, and that's just the coolest thing. So that was Astrotrain's first mode, a really compact locomotive that really doesn't suffer much from the fact he's a triple changer. In fact, if nothing else, it sort of benefits from it. So now let's take a change of pace and talk about Starscream. Starscream is very much clearly based on an F-15. This isn't news. He was an unlicensed F-15 here, he was for the Masterpiece, for Unit Class Iterations, for Masterpiece, for Earthrise, for Kingdom, and for Masterpiece, and I'm sure a bunch of other iterations I'm forgetting. There's been so many blatant attempts to recreate the look without a mention of a single boring McDonald's. The exception here is this is the most F-15 a non-Masterpiece Starscream has achieved, with the shape of the canopy itself being more F-15 than it is 14 like the Earthrise and Chug versions are. That aside, though, I love how great this thing looks. I mean, it's by no means a case of, if you didn't know, you'd never know it was a Transformer, and yeah, the robot totally suffers for it, and no, the jet's not flawless, but all that aside, it still looks like a flight-worthy jet. Like, take a look at the side profile, and a lot of that blocky undercarriage of other takes in the figure is entirely absent, and I think it looks great because of that. I love the little landing gear. It not being fixed is a little disappointing, but that could honestly be the slogan on the box of this figure, because literally everything comes off on this, which makes wings, stabilizers, hands, and gears, all of it is the most easily lost thing on this figure, and finding an original figure that still has every single part is next to impossible. The fact that this figure has all its parts that it does, and being what I'm fairly certain is an original G1 due to its short null raise and the molded copyright saying 83 on it, that's really impressive. Anyway, the point I was trying to make before getting sidetracked is that because the gear isn't permanently attached, it gets to rotate, which means you can animate the thing taxiing around an airport, and that's kinda cool. The canopy opens, which isn't something a lot of Starscreams get if they're not Masterpiece figures, but when a jet plane figure does get it, it is pretty cool. Another cool thing that I learned from having the G1 in hand is the tail fin decal design. I know the double stripe at the top was a thing, but what I never knew before is that the white lines were a drop shadow of the design, and not just thin pinstriping. And knowing this is just such a better design. Like, I really like the look of that. It just sort of pops and makes the tail fins look interesting. Not to say that this is bad, I totally take it over the plain fins the cartoon accuracy leaves us with, but the point remains, the G1 design is just cool. In general, I find the G1 Starscream vehicle mode just really, really awesome. Easily the best part of the whole package. Also interesting to see is that it's about the same size as the Earthrise jet mode. Like, even after all these years, the jet mode scale of Starscream finally returns to the G1 and... Wait a second. If Earthrise is the same size, then that means... Well, G1 Starscream is also HO scale. How cool is that? And from a few videos back, we figured out that Astrotrain in G1 is HO scale as well for a narrow gauge railway, which means these two figures are actually in scale. For Decepticons in G1, that's unheard of. Man, G1 is the gift that keeps on giving, isn't it? Anyway, let's tackle the final vehicle mode. To get there, start by folding the third driving wheel forward. Rotate out the rest of these plates, flip over the unit, open these wings and fold up the tips. Open these panels and rotate up the nose cone. Open the cab of the locomotive, pull up the tail fin and slide it all the way back. And here's shuttle mode, where all the stickers have shown up tenfold, for better or for worse. Like, in general, I feel without the stickers kind of look better, but that's totally up to you what you do decide to put on yours and how you want yours to look. Aesthetics aside, this is a really clean shuttle. It's not perfect, but, it's a triple changer. Naturally, there's going to be some sacrifice. And considering this could have been the sacrifice, forgive me if I call this clean. Just all around, you can hold this in your hand, and it's not hard to imagine the shuttle vibes this thing gives off. For the 12 or 13 years I've owned a G1 Astrotrain, I've always quite liked this mode. Even right down to the thrusters. You compare this to a fellow shuttle mode Transformer Skylinks, and it just looks so great even with its triple changing shortcomings. I really, really like the idea from way back when that they made this where it's like, hey, you know the overhang of a steam locomotive cab's roof? Well, flip the whole train over, it's like the plate at the bottom of a shuttle's booster array. It's such a clever reusing of vehicle geometry without having to fold stuff away and bring out the other stuff. It's just really fun and clever, and something that we ended up losing for the War for Cybertron release. Something that the Skylinks comparison shows us, though, is the size discrepancy, which leads me to my next point about the size of the figure in this mode. Mass shifting is one of those things that Astrotrain and Broadside sure seem to contend with. Like, on one side, you have a perfectly scaled duo. On the other side, it all just goes out the airlock. Core Class Starscream and Skylinks are about what Astrotrain and Starscream should be in terms of vehicle scale. It doesn't mean Astrotrain is bad, I just think it's funny. In scale, not in scale. In scale, not in scale. And for one last image, the Decepticons next to all the G1 stuff I own. So that was Astrotrain and Starscream, my favorite Decepticon next to a character in a show I like that has a really cool alt mode. They've got their faults, by no means am I denying that, but they still got great relics of the past, with a very heavy emphasis on vehicle mode with the robot springing from that. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Speaking of which, let's hit that up right after we hear a word from our sponsor. Stay tuned.
The Transformers will return after these messages. We now return to the Transformers.
So on to transformation. Start by returning the cockpit to the legs, and then separate and extend them until they click into their detents. Pull the arms out, slide the tail fin down a bit, and then open it up. Pull open the back of the thrusters to reveal a head, and finally pop in that blaster. On Starscream, remove that landing gear, and the safest place at this point for it is stowing it in the cockpit. Rotate the horizontal stabilizer backwards to form a flat base. Rotate the feet down, rotate the wings halfway to give clearance to work, rotate down the cockpit, and through the cavity which will then push apart the arms to swing around and down. Then put the head in place. Swing the wings up into position, replace the null rays, and if you happen to have them lying around, the hands, and you're done. And here we have Astrotrain and Starscream. Astrotrain's transformation is really simple, and I quite like it for that, but only that, the simplicity of it, nothing more. Starscream, on the other hand, is really fiddly with junk always clanging into each other in a really unsatisfying way, and the end result is alright. Like a kid in the 80s, I'm sure, could use his imagination to fill in the gaps as it slightly resembles the character, but we do have to remember the character came after the toy. So it's not like the toy was aiming for a certain aesthetic or anything. Though if you are looking to make your G1 toy resemble more closely the animation model, a user named Maverick Prime has made both upgrades and replacement parts for the Seekers, as losing these pieces is almost a prerequisite for finding a used copy. That all being said, it's not like there isn't good points to talk about. I like the big clompy feet this figure has while simultaneously using the vertical stabilizers as heel spurs. Future mainline versions of this mold would fold these up a little more discreetly, but here, under early 1980s toy design limitations, I think it makes a good use for vehicle geometry in a robot. Something else I think is fairly interesting is the G1 Seeker design maintains a fairly clean robot back. Like, it's not perfect, as you still have the nose cone pointing out at the back of the head, but it's not like a modern release has figured out what to do with the nose cone either, so all things considered, it's pretty good. As for Astrotrain, he's a bit of an oddity. I personally really enjoy both of the alt modes and think they do really well even with the slight kibblage left over from the other mode. Robot, on the other hand, I feel is sort of what was cobbled together after they finished the alt mode designs. Like, arms. Here, just take a chunk of the shuttle and pop it out. Oh, legs? Split the cab and extend them, I guess? And the head? I don't know, just hide that in the boosters. Like, as far as proportions go, it's so wonky looking. Shins are as long as the torso, with thighs nearly non-existent, and the arms are half the length of the torso. This is about the second most bizarre looking robot out of the whole Transformers line. As far as the head goes, it's fine. Like, it's a really good looking head on its own merit with a good looking visor. I just don't get where the animation head comes from, as the similarities it shares with its original source are vague inspirations at best. As for the back of the figure, it looks fairly clean. I love the boosters back here, like at any moment Astrotrain could start up a shine spark, and it's a design that other iterations of the figure have retained. Finally, we come to the blaster as Astrotrain's only accessory, which really does nothing to quell my thoughts of how wonky this all is. Like, imagine if you had arms that stopped at your elbow, but you also have to wield a rifle that's the length of your whole body. Astrotrain's robot mode is so dang weird, and honestly, that kind of gives it a certain charm, wouldn't you think? As for other homages though, the Siege tried to replicate it, but I don't exactly think it did a great job. And weirdly enough, Siege Megatron came with a blaster that I felt best resembled a modern take once you take apart the sword blades from it. So let's talk articulation. On Starscream, the fins move about, but just barely. The feet can also rise if you need them to. The wings can both rotate on their hinge and swivel back, and when used in conjunction, you can kind of pull off that look with a more dynamic wing placement. Kind of like the animation had, as well as the Siege Starscream pulls off. Or you can place them straight and rigid like the Earthrise one did as well. The arms both rotate and swing out on the transformation hinge, and the null-rays are spring-loaded action for all your firing fun. The head, on the other hand, is something I've always found quite interesting. You very much have the original Starscream head situated here, and the animation model chose to use this molded detail on the nose cone as little extra molding on the helmet. However, another neat thing is the articulation allows you to pay homage to Dan Aykroyd and make Starscream a cone head. It's like Starscream gets to pick and choose his luck on how it's feeling that day. Season 1 Seeker, Season 2 Seeker. 1, 2, 1. As for Astrotrain's articulation, he has ball-jointed shoulders. That's it. However, you also have the option to fold away his chest wings to allow more range and be more animation accurate. You can also see remnant of this design in something like the Siege figure, where you get this very noticeable ridge running up the chest where the G1 has his tail fin. That was drawn on screen and translated to this toy. Kinda neat to see the history of where these mold choices are and where they come from. For scale comparison, here's Scream and Train next to the other 4 Autobots I own. And, well, it is kinda cool to see the scale relation of these bots was translated so well into the show that when you see the modern takes of these figures, it's kinda cool to see that not much has changed over the years. As for other comparisons, here's Starscream with his very different iterations of toys, and Astrotrain releases as well, excluding classics of course. So that was my review of G1 Starscream and Astrotrain. I'm glad that Astrotrain has finally received a proper video, and it was really neat to take an in-depth look into a G1 Decepticon figure I've never really handled before. This has been the Lazy Eyebrow.